It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I was halfway through a microwaved dinner, and halfway through regretting every decision that led me back to my childhood bedroom when my phone buzzed. The name lit up. Dale, my mom's old friend from church who ran logistics for a regional trucking company. I answered out of obligation, not curiosity. "Jesse," he said, "you still looking to get out of that town for a while?" I paused, fork midair. "I guess." He chuckled like he'd expected that answer. "Got a cross-country run starting tomorrow. One of my teams is heading west. You wouldn't be driving, just riding along. Couple days." I figured it'd do some good. At that point, I would have agreed to herd alpacas through the Rockies if it meant escaping the walls of my mother's house and the quiet judgment of the town I used to call mine. I didn't ask who the team was. I just said yes. By noon the next day, I was sitting on the edge of a worn leather seat inside a long-nosed Peterbilt that smelled like engine grease, old coffee, and peppermint gum. The sun beat down off the concrete lot as Dale introduced me to the two men I'd be sharing a cab with for the next several days. "Jesse, meet Hank and Troy." Hank stepped forward first, big, broad-chested, with a salt and pepper beard and a handshake that could break concrete. He smiled easily and patted me on the shoulder like we were already family. "You ever been in a truck before?" he asked. "Only on TV," I said, and he laughed. "You'll be fine." Troy, on the other hand, was quieter. Taller than Hank, wiry but solid, with a jawline like a sculpture and eyes that gave nothing away. He didn't offer a handshake, just a nod, one corner of his mouth twitching like he might smile, but changed his mind. I wasn't sure if I'd annoyed him already, or if that was just his face. We pulled out of the lot 15 minutes later, Hank behind the wheel, Troy navigating, and me stuck between silence and engine hum. I watched the flat stretch of Missouri fall away behind us, small towns like punctuation marks along the highway. I'd forgotten how vast everything felt once you left the grid of home. Hank filled the cab with stories, tales of near misses, funny truck stop encounters, once even a tale about hauling a live camel for a circus gig in the 90s. He was the kind of man who carried history like it was a coat he could shrug on whenever he pleased. Troy didn't speak much, but every now and then he'd correct Hank on a detail, always quietly and always right. At the first truck stop, Hank bought me a hot dog and a bag of chips like I was a kid on a school field trip. Troy wandered off on his own and came back with a black coffee and a protein bar, which he unwrapped slowly, eyes fixed out the window. By nightfall, we were somewhere in Oklahoma, the horizon melting into violet and copper tones that made the road shimmer like glass. Hank was snoring gently in the sleeper bunk behind us while Troy drove. I sat in the passenger seat, trying to keep my eyes open. "You can sleep," Troy said suddenly. His voice was deeper than I expected, measured, a little rough, like it wasn't used to being heard over engine noise. "I'm okay." He glanced at me, then back at the road. "You from around Springfield?"
"Yeah."
"Born and raised." He nodded like that confirmed something. "You don't seem like the kind that sticks around." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation, so I didn't answer right away. I didn't plan to, but things didn't go how I expected. They rarely do. That hung in the air between us, and for the first time all day, the silence felt shared rather than awkward. I watched the shadows from the dashboard lights play over his face, sharp lines softened by exhaustion and the gentle hum of the highway. "Why do you do this?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "Driving?"
"Yeah."
"All this? Weeks on the road? Sleeping in a metal box? Doesn't it get lonely?" His fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. "It does. But I've been lonelier in other places." Something in the way he said it made my chest ache a little. I didn't know this man, barely knew anything about him, but I recognized that feeling. That strange comfort in being nowhere, in being unseen. We pulled into a rest area around midnight, the glow from the overhead lights making the parking lot look like a movie set. Troy cut the engine, and the truck rumbled into stillness. Hank stirred behind us, grumbled something about getting old, then offered to take the top bunk. I crawled into the lower one, still dressed, still buzzing with thoughts. As I lay there, staring up at the mattress above me and listening to the faint hiss of diesel engines outside. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Troy had answered my question. Like he'd carved out a space on the road, not just for the job, but to hide something. And for reasons I couldn't explain yet, I wanted to know what that something was. I didn't fall asleep for a long time, but when I did, I dreamed of open highways and eyes that said everything without speaking a word. The next morning started with black coffee and the sharp bite of early winter wind as we climbed back into the cab. Hank whistled a tune I didn't recognize while adjusting the mirrors, and Troy sat beside him with the same quiet detachment I was starting to associate with everything about him. I had a feeling he carried silence like armor. We moved westward, into Texas, the land flattening out into a sun-drenched sprawl. Days bled together in stretches of road and conversations that always seemed to begin with Hank and end with Troy looking out the window. I kept a small notebook in my backpack, filling it with phrases, sketches, the occasional attempt at poetry. I'd stopped writing after college, but there was something about the road that stirred things up again, like movement made room for thought. By the third day, I'd settled into the rhythm of it. How the engine hummed at cruising speed, how rest stops always smelled faintly like burnt coffee and pine-scented cleaner, how Hank's jokes filled empty space like music. Troy still spoke sparingly, but I noticed he always remembered how I took my coffee and that he'd tilt his head slightly when I laughed, like he was listening without showing it. That afternoon, we stopped at a truck plaza outside Albuquerque. Hank headed off to check on a mechanical issue with the trailer, leaving me and Troy alone at a corner booth in the diner. The waitress brought us meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and thick slices of pie. Troy ate methodically, like he was fueling a machine, but he surprised me when he spoke first. "Why'd you really come along?" he asked without looking up. I set down my fork. "Because I needed to feel like I was going somewhere." He nodded, chewing slowly, letting silence take over again. I didn't expect anything more, but then he said, "I used to feel that way. Before I figured out I didn't know where I wanted to end up." I leaned back, watching him. "And now?" "I still don't know, but I'm used to it." There was no self-pity in his tone, no bitterness, just quiet acceptance. That scared me more than any pain could. The idea of settling into uncertainty, as if it were furniture. We drove into the evening, mountains rising faint in the distance like sleeping giants. I found myself studying the profile of his face in the dusk, how the light traced the ridge of his cheekbone, the curve of his jaw. There was a calm there I didn't understand, something worn in and tired but not broken. I couldn't decide if I envied it or feared it. That night, we parked at a smaller truck stop surrounded by dry brush and faded signs. Hank headed straight for the showers, leaving me and Troy again in the cab. He sat in the driver's seat, engine off, hands still on the wheel. "I don't think I was supposed to stay in Springfield," I said suddenly. The words spilled out before I could catch them. "I don't think I belong anywhere, really. But when I'm out here, I don't feel stuck." That's new for me. Troy didn't move. He just looked ahead, the lines of his face unreadable. "I used to think," I continued, "that if I found the right place, everything would make sense. But maybe it's not about the place." He turned his head slowly toward me. "Maybe it's about the people." My breath caught. For the first time, his eyes didn't look distant. They looked deliberate. I nodded, throat tight. "Maybe." We didn't talk after that. Just sat in the stillness while the desert cooled around us and the wind tapped softly against the glass. The next day, the air felt different. Lighter. Like something had shifted, even if it hadn't been said outright. I caught Troy looking at me once in the side mirror while I adjusted a box in the back. He didn't look away when I noticed. Just gave the smallest nod, like a shared secret. Late that evening, while Hank was on the phone with his wife near the fuel pumps, Troy offered to show me how the logging system worked. We sat side by side in the cab, elbows nearly touching as he walked me through the screens and buttons. His hands moved confidently, his voice low but certain. I asked him how long he'd been doing this, expecting a number. Instead, he said, "Long enough to forget what it's like to stop." He looked at me then, really looked, eyes darker in the dashboard light, gaze steady. And before I could respond, before I could even process what it meant, he turned away. But that moment sat heavy between us the rest of the night. Not awkward. Not forced. Just something unspoken, something waiting. By the time we crossed into Arizona, the road had started to feel less like an escape and more like a thread pulling me toward something. Something uncertain, maybe even dangerous in its quiet intensity. But I wasn't afraid of it. I was afraid of what would happen if I pretended not to feel it. By the time we rolled into northern Arizona, the sky had begun to bruise with storm clouds. What had started as a quiet gray morning turned steadily into wind and slush, and eventually, a steady snowfall that made the roads shimmer like glass under the truck's headlights. Hank checked the weather app for the third time, his brow creasing deeper with each refresh. "We're not climbing Flagstaff in this mess," he muttered, putting the phone down. "Not tonight. We'll pull off. Wait it out." Troy nodded without question and turned the wheel toward the exit ramp, where an old roadside motel stood against a backdrop of skeletal pines and cold mist. The neon sign blinked half-lit, reading Oak Hollow Inn. A gas station sat across the lot, its pumps idle and snow-dusted. There was nothing else for miles. Inside, the lobby smelled like pine-scented cleaner and microwaved popcorn. Hank booked 2 rooms, one for himself and one with 2 beds for me and Troy. He handed us the key card and grinned like he'd just made a clever joke. "Don't hog the blankets, boys." The room was basic. Beige walls, a small heater rattling near the floor, and 2 narrow beds separated by a nightstand with a flickering lamp. I dropped my backpack at the foot of one bed, unsure what to say. Troy removed his boots and jacket in silence, folding everything with practiced efficiency before sitting down and pulling out a book from his duffel. "You read?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "When I can." He held up the cover, Of Mice and Men. "Rereading." I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of my bed, and glanced at the window. The snow had thickened, swallowing the lot outside in a sheet of white. The room felt unusually still, like we'd stepped outside time. We didn't speak for a while. I scrolled through my phone, then set it aside. My thoughts kept circling back to him. How he always sat so composed, as if anything he gave away would cost too much. I lay back, staring at the ceiling. "Can I ask you something?" I said eventually. He looked over, waiting. "Why are you always so guarded?" He blinked once, then closed the book. "You think I'm guarded?" "I think you're like a safe with no keyhole." Troy leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been on the road a long time. Long enough to know that not everyone needs to know everything." "That's fair," I said. "But sometimes it feels like you're afraid to let anyone close." He didn't respond right away. The heater clicked. Outside, the wind howled past the window like it was trying to get in. "I've lost people before," he said finally. "People I let close. And when you lose someone like that, you start thinking maybe it's easier not to open the door next time." His voice was even, but his hands had stilled on the blanket. I wanted to reach across the space between us, but I didn't. "I'm not trying to break down any doors," I said. "But I think you don't have to carry that weight alone. Not all the time." He looked up then and for once didn't look away. "You're different," he said. "Most people don't bother looking past the surface." "Maybe I'm just curious." He tilted his head slightly. "You're something else." We turned in after that, each settling into our respective beds. The light stayed on, dim and flickering, casting soft shadows along the ceiling. I lay with my back to him, eyes open, heart loud in my chest. "You ever miss someone who never really belonged to you?" I asked into the dark. A pause. "Every day." I turned slowly to face him. His eyes were already on me, steady and unreadable. Then you know how hard it is to ignore it when it finally feels like someone sees you. Troy sat up, the blanket falling around his waist. He looked exhausted, but not from the road, from years of carrying silence like a shield. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, crossing to the window. He pressed a hand to the cold glass, watching the snow fall. "I see you, Jesse," he said quietly. I sat up too, the sheets pulled around me. "Then why won't you let me in?" He turned around slowly. Because I don't know how. That honesty struck me harder than any rejection could have. I rose and walked over to him, stopping just short. His eyes flicked to mine. No fear. Just hesitation. You don't have to know how, I said. You just have to want to try. He reached out, not boldly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty, and placed his hand on my shoulder. The touch was warm and grounding. I didn't move. I didn't speak. We stood there like that, close enough to feel the breath between us, as the snow covered everything outside, burying the road, the distance, the years behind us. Neither of us said another word. But in that silence, something finally opened. The storm held us longer than we expected. What was supposed to be a night in the motel turned into 2, then 3. The snow didn't just fall. It settled in thick, unrelenting waves, burying the trucks and swallowing the horizon. Road closures stretched from one town to the next. Hank took it in stride, using the time to call his grandkids and polish every inch of the chrome on his rig. But for me and Troy, something more complicated settled in during those days, something unspoken but heavy, like snow piling on a roof not built for it. We didn't talk about what happened that first night. Didn't talk about the closeness, the look, the touch. But we didn't go back to before, either. Something had shifted, gently, irreversibly. When I handed him coffee now, his fingers brushed mine and didn't rush to pull away. When we sat on the motel couch and watched reruns, he let his knee rest near mine, not touching but close enough that the warmth passed between us like a silent conversation. But the quiet stretched differently now. Less guarded, more loaded. Every glance felt like a question left unanswered. Every shared moment edged toward a line neither of us was sure how to cross. On the second evening, we sat in the small, wood-panel lobby while Hank chatted up the motel manager about snowplow schedules. I was sketching in my notebook. Lines without form, shapes that looked like long roads and unfamiliar hands. Troy sat across from me, flipping through a magazine he clearly wasn't reading. "I've been thinking about that thing you said," he said suddenly. I looked up. "Which part?" He hesitated. "About not having to carry it all alone." I closed my notebook. "And I'm not used to someone wanting to know the real parts of me. Most people only want the easy version." "I didn't ask for easy," I said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When I was younger, I tried. Once. To be open. To be seen. But it ended bad. Small town, wrong people. Cost me more than I was ready to lose." I didn't interrupt. His voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind each word. "I got jumped outside a bar," he continued. "Nothing broken, but it left a mark. After that, I kept it all to myself. Just safer that way." My chest tightened. Not from pity, but from the brutal familiarity of it. I'd seen that same fear in mirrors, heard that same silence in my own voice when people asked why I never dated in college. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was the only thing I could offer that felt true. Troy shrugged lightly. "Was a long time ago. Doesn't mean it stopped mattering." He looked up then, straight at me. His eyes weren't hard anymore. They were tired. Honest. That night in the motel, I haven't felt that close to anyone in years. And it scared the hell out of me. I nodded slowly. "Me too." He exhaled, almost a laugh, but more of a release. "I don't know what this is," he said, "but I think I want to figure it out." My breath caught. Even if the road ends soon? Especially if it does. We sat in silence for a while, not because there was nothing left to say, but because we'd finally said something that mattered. That night, in the shared room, the distance between our beds vanished. We didn't rush. It wasn't about hunger or desire, it was about letting the walls down, finally. His hand in mine, his breath close, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We lay facing each other under a single blanket, the world outside frozen and quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to run from who I was. The next morning, the sun rose bright and blinding over a snow-covered world. Roads were opening. Trucks grown back to life. Hank knocked on the door with a grin and the smell of motel coffee. You lovebirds ready to hit the road? He joked, not waiting for an answer. Troy looked at me as I packed my bag. You still feel like you're going somewhere? I zipped the bag shut.
Yeah.
But now it feels like I'm not going alone. He nodded, smiled. A real one, rare and unguarded.
Good.
We hit the road by mid-morning, heading west again, the wheels spinning fresh tracks into thawing asphalt. The cab felt different now, not just because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't been hidden anymore. We still had miles to go, maybe only a few more days before the delivery ended, and I'd have to decide where I really belonged. But for now, I had a seat by the window, a road stretching ahead, and someone beside me who finally let me see the truth behind the silence. And for the first time, the journey felt like home.